Carson Blackwell adjusted his tie in the reflection of his Range Rover's window, parked outside yet another home care agency in Sandy Springs. At 16, he controlled a $2.4 billion tech empire, but he couldn't solve the one problem that mattered most. His grandfather Walter hadn't spoken a single word in 14 months, not since the stroke that stole his voice, but left his mind sharp as ever. Carson's latest offer was simple, desperate, and expensive: $50,000 to any caregiver who could make his grandfather speak just one word within 30 days. 5 highly trained professionals had already failed. The sliding glass doors of Premier Home Care opened with a soft whoosh, and Carson found himself face to face with Keisha Washington. 34, confident without being cocky, wearing scrubs that had seen real work. Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct. She'd read his file, knew the challenge, understood the stakes. But when Carson started his rehearsed pitch about the bonus money, she raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not interested in your $50,000, she said. Carson blinked, thrown off script. "I'm interested in your grandfather, and I think you've been asking the wrong question." Carson's jaw tightened. He'd heard variations of this before. Every caregiver thought they had the secret formula, the magic touch that would unlock Walter's voice. "What's the right question, then?" "Not whether he can talk," Keisha replied, gathering her purse and car keys. "Whether he's already trying to." The drive to Buckhead took them through Atlanta's afternoon traffic, past the familiar blur of Peachtree Street and Piedmont Road. Carson found himself studying this woman who just turned down more money than most people made in 2 years. She asked pointed questions about Walter's routine, his history with the company, his interests before the stroke. When Carson mentioned his grandfather's obsession with puzzles and cryptography during his engineering days, Keisha made a note, not in her phone, but on an actual piece of paper. "Tell me about the other caregivers," she said, as they turned into the gated community. Carson's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Professional, experienced, they all tried the same approaches. Speech therapy exercises, cognitive stimulation, picture cards, standard rehabilitation protocols. His voice carried the frustration of months of dead ends. Nothing worked. Grandpa just sits there organizing paper clips or touching that old clock every morning at 8:47. The doctors say it's just repetitive behavior. Meaningless. Keisha made another note. "Meaningless," she repeated, but her tone suggested she disagreed. The Blackwell mansion sat on 3 acres in the heart of Buckhead, its neo-Georgian columns and manicured lawns screaming old money. But inside, Carson led her through rooms that felt more like a medical facility than a home. Hospital bed in the master suite, grab bars in the hallway, a bathroom converted for wheelchair access. The scent of disinfectant hung in the air, sterile and sad. Walter Blackwell sat in his favorite leather chair in what used to be his study, now converted into a day room. At 78, he remained imposing even in silence. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his clothes pressed and coordinated. Someone was taking care of him, but his eyes, pale blue and alert, followed their movement with an intensity that spoke to a mind still very much present. "Grandpa," Carson said, his voice taking on a forced cheerfulness, "this is Keisha. She's going to help take care of you." Walter's gaze shifted to Keisha, studying her with the same careful attention Carson had noticed him giving to his paperclips. She approached slowly, respectfully, and sat down across from him rather than towering over his chair. "Mr. Blackwell," she said simply, "I've heard you built some impressive systems in your day." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Walter's face. Not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. Then he returned his attention to the small pile of office supplies on the table beside him, methodically arranging paper clips by size, then color, then size again. Carson watched this familiar ritual with barely concealed impatience. "He does that for hours. The doctors say it's just keeping his hands busy." But Keisha was watching with professional interest, noting the precision of Walter's movements, the consistency of his patterns. When he finished arranging the clips, he touched the face of an antique alarm clock just once with his index finger. The same gesture Carson had seen him make every morning at exactly 8:47 for the past 14 months. Has he always been precise about time? Keisha asked. Dad used to joke that Grandpa could set his watch by Walter's routines, Carson replied. But now it's just... He waved his hand dismissively. Behavior, Keisha finished. I understand you're under some pressure about his care. Carson's expression darkened, the understatement of the year. The board of directors meets monthly to discuss costs. Home care runs $18,000 a month, and insurance only covers 60%. They're pushing hard for institutional placement. Keeping him here doesn't make business sense. He looked at his grandfather, frustration and love warring in his young face. But I can't just ship him off to some facility. Walter, meanwhile, had moved on to organizing pens. 5 blue ballpoints, 3 black, 2 red. He arranged them in rows, then triangular patterns, then lines again. Each movement was deliberate, purposeful in a way that suggested more than mindless activity. Keisha pulled out her notebook again. I'd like to spend the next few days just observing, if that's all right. Getting to know his rhythms, his preferences. The others said the same thing, Carson replied, but his tone had lost some of its edge. How long before you start the real therapy? This is the real therapy, Keisha said. Understanding who he is before we figure out how he communicates. That first evening, Carson left them alone. The house felt different with Keisha there, less clinical somehow. She moved around the study with quiet efficiency, noting where Walter looked, what caught his attention, how he responded to different sounds and activities. She observed him at dinner, watching how he used his utensils, how he organized food on his plate. Everything had a system. The breakthrough came on day 3. Keisha was helping Walter with his morning routine when she noticed something the others had missed. The paperclip organizing wasn't random repetition. Walter arranged them in specific patterns depending on the day. Monday was always size-based sorting. Tuesday brought color arrangements. Wednesday meant geometric patterns. There was logic, intention, structure. Mr. Blackwell, she said quietly, sitting beside his chair, you're not just organizing, are you? You're communicating. Walter's hands stilled. He looked directly at her, and this time the acknowledgement was unmistakable. Then he picked up a blue paperclip and placed it in the upper left corner of a napkin. A red one went to the upper right, black to lower left, green to lower right. Keisha's pulse quickened. Coordinates, she whispered. You're using coordinates. Carson arrived from his morning meetings at Blackwell Technologies to find Keisha sitting on the floor of his grandfather's study, surrounded by office supplies and notebook pages covered in diagrams. Walter was in his chair, leaning forward with more engagement than Carson had seen from him in months. What's all this? Carson asked. Keisha looked up, excitement barely contained in her professional demeanor. Your grandfather isn't trying to organize objects. He's trying to tell us something. Watch. She placed a blank piece of paper on the table and handed Walter a pen. Mr. Blackwell, can you show Carson the pattern? Walter took the pen and drew 4 dots on the paper, creating a square. Then he touched the upper left dot with the pen tip, then upper right, lower left, a simple sequence, but Carson could see the intentionality behind it. I don't understand, Carson said. Grid system, Keisha explained. Like coordinates on a map. I think your grandfather developed his own communication method. Each position might represent a letter or a concept or an instruction. She turned to Walter. Is that right, Mr. Blackwell? Walter touched his nose, then pointed to Keisha, the closest thing to a yes they'd seen from him in over a year. Carson sank into a nearby chair, staring at his grandfather with new eyes. You mean he's been trying to talk to us this whole time? Not talk, Keisha corrected. Communicate. There's a difference. Over the following week, Keisha worked with Walter to decode his system. It was complex, sophisticated, and utterly logical. Each quadrant of a grid represented different categories: Upper left was people, upper right was objects, lower left was actions, lower right was descriptors. Within each quadrant, specific positions corresponded to specific words. Walter had essentially created his own language, complete with grammar and syntax. The process was painstaking. Walter would position objects or touch specific spots on paper, and Keisha would work through possible meanings like solving a crossword puzzle. Gradually, patterns emerged. When Walter wanted water, he would touch the upper right quadrant 3 positions down. When he was tired, it was lower right, 2nd position. When he wanted to work on puzzles, it was a complex sequence involving multiple quadrants. Carson watched these sessions with growing amazement and mounting guilt. His grandfather had been trying to communicate for months, and no one had bothered to listen. "How did you figure it out?" Carson asked during one of their evening debriefings. "Your grandfather was an engineer," Keisha replied, cleaning up the day's materials. "Engineers don't stop being engineers just because they have a stroke. They adapt. They find new ways to build systems." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The question is, why did he develop something so complex when simpler methods might work just as well?" Carson didn't have an answer, but the question bothered him. Walter had always been direct, efficient. The elaborate grid system seemed almost deliberately complicated, like he was trying to prove something. The answer came during Carson's monthly board meeting at One Atlantic Center. He sat in the 47th floor conference room, listening to the directors debate his grandfather's care costs, when his phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. "Emergency at the house. Walter is agitated. Can you come home?" Carson excused himself from the meeting and raced back to Buckhead, his Range Rover eating up the miles on I-285. He found Walter in his study, objects scattered across his table, his usually precise movements jerky and frustrated. Keisha sat nearby, clearly worried. "He's been like this for an hour," she explained, "ever since I mentioned that you were at a board meeting. I think he knows what they're discussing." Carson knelt beside his grandfather's chair. "Grandpa, are you worried about the meeting?" Walter's response was immediate and complex. He touched multiple positions on his grid, spelling out something that took Keisha several minutes to decode. When she finished, her face was pale. "What did he say?" Carson asked. "He said, 'Tell them I'm not broken. Tell them I can still work.'" The words hit Carson like a physical blow. His grandfather wasn't just trying to communicate. He was trying to prove his worth, to show that his mind remained sharp, even if his voice was gone. The elaborate grid system wasn't just adaptation, it was demonstration. Walter was showing anyone who cared to look that he was still the brilliant engineer who had helped build Blackwell Technologies from nothing. Carson looked at his grandfather with new understanding. "You want to come back to work, don't you?" Walter's nod was immediate and emphatic. "But the board doesn't think you're competent anymore," Carson continued, pieces clicking into place. "They see the silence and assume cognitive decline." Another nod, this one sad and resigned. Carson stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the Atlanta skyline stretched toward the horizon, dominated by the gleaming towers where his grandfather had once held court. "What if I brought them here? What if you could show them your system yourself?" Walter's expression transformed. For the first time in months, Carson saw hope in those pale blue eyes. "Keisha," Carson said, turning to the caregiver who had unlocked his grandfather's voice, "how quickly can you teach me his language?" The next 72 hours were intensive. Keisha worked with both Carson and Walter, helping the teenager understand the nuances of his grandfather's communication system while coaching Walter through increasingly complex expressions. Carson was a quick study, his tech-savvy mind grasping the logical patterns quickly. But it was more than intellectual exercise. For the first time since the stroke, grandfather and grandson were truly communicating. Walter shared memories of building the company, insights about current projects, even specific concerns about market positioning. His mind was not only intact, but actively engaged with business strategy. Carson found himself taking notes, not just on the communication method, but on his grandfather's ideas. "Why didn't you push back harder when the doctors said he was declining?" Carson asked Keisha during one of their brief breaks. "Because they weren't wrong about what they observed," she replied. "Your grandfather wasn't responding to traditional therapy. He wasn't following standard protocols. From their perspective, he was being non-compliant." She paused. "But sometimes non-compliance is just a different kind of competence." The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. Carson had requested that it be moved to the house, citing his grandfather's comfort and convenience. The directors agreed reluctantly, more curious than optimistic about what the young CEO wanted to demonstrate. They arrived in expensive cars and expensive suits, filing into the study that had been Walter's domain for decades. Carson had arranged chairs in a semicircle around his grandfather, who sat in his usual leather chair, wearing his best suit and a calm expression. Keisha stood to one side, notebook ready, professional and invisible in the way that support staff often are. Board Chairman Robert Hayes, a man who had worked with Walter for 30 years, took the lead. "Carson, we appreciate you bringing us here, but our position remains unchanged. The medical reports are clear about your grandfather's condition, and the care costs are simply unsustainable for—" "Mr. Hayes," Carson interrupted. "With respect, I don't think you understand my grandfather's condition as well as you believe." Hayes's eyebrows rose. "Son, I've known Walter since before you were born. I've seen the medical reports. I understand this is difficult, but—" Walter raised his hand, stopping the conversation. Then with deliberate precision, he began positioning objects on his table. A pen in the upper left corner of a napkin, a paperclip in the upper right, a coin in the lower left. The sequence continued for several minutes, each placement careful and intentional. The board members exchanged glances, clearly confused by what appeared to be meaningless busy work, but Carson was watching intently, translating each position in real time. "He says," Carson began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "that the Patterson acquisition was a mistake. The integration costs exceeded projections by 40% because we underestimated their legacy system complexity." Silence fell over the room. The Patterson acquisition had been completed 6 months ago, well after Walter's stroke, and the integration problems were known only to senior staff. Hayes leaned forward. How could he possibly— Walter was already positioning new objects, his movements confident now. Carson continued translating. "He says the Singapore expansion should be delayed until Q3 because their regulatory framework changes take effect in June, and early entry will require expensive compliance modifications." More silence. The Singapore project was classified information, discussed only in executive sessions. Walter continued his object positioning, building increasingly complex statements. He outlined 3 current projects by name, identified specific inefficiencies in their quarterly budget allocation, and suggested modifications to their patent filing strategy that would save an estimated $200K in legal fees. When he finished, the room was completely quiet. These weren't generic business observations or lucky guesses. This was detailed, current, strategic thinking from someone who clearly remained deeply engaged with company operations. Hayes was the first to speak. "Walter," he said, his voice tentative, "is that really you in there?" Walter responded by spelling out a single word with his object positioning. Carson read it aloud. "Always." Dr. Patricia Chang, the board's medical advisor, leaned forward. "This communication method, how long have you been working with it?" Keisha stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Blackwell developed the system himself over the past several months. I just helped identify and refine it." But his medical reports indicate significant cognitive decline," Dr. Chang continued. "His medical reports indicate non-responsiveness to traditional therapy approaches," Keisha corrected gently. "There's a difference. Mr. Blackwell's mind is sharp. He just needed a different way to show it." Hayes looked from Walter to Carson to Keisha, clearly struggling to process this new reality. If this is accurate, if Walter is truly this mentally engaged, then institutional placement isn't just unnecessary, Carson finished. It's cruel and professionally wasteful. The board spent another hour with Walter, asking questions through Carson's translation and marveling at the sophistication of the communication system. Walter answered each query with precision and insight, demonstrating not just competence, but genuine expertise in areas where his decades of experience remained invaluable. As the meeting wound down, Hayes approached Walter directly. "I owe you an apology, old friend. We should have looked harder for ways to hear you." Walter's response, translated through Carson, was gracious. "You saw what the systems showed you. Now we build better systems." After the board members left, Carson found himself alone with his grandfather and Keisha in the study where this journey had begun. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating the objects and papers that had become Walter's new vocabulary. "I owe you an apology too, Grandpa," Carson said quietly. "I almost gave up on you." Walter positioned objects with careful precision. Carson read, "Never gave up on you." The simple statement hit harder than any lecture could have. Carson realized that throughout these difficult months, even in his silence, Walter had been watching, evaluating, trusting his grandson to eventually understand. "Keisha," Carson said, turning to the woman who had made this moment possible. "I know I originally offered $50,000, but—" She raised a hand, smiling. "I told you I wasn't interested in the money." "But you should be interested in a job," Carson continued. "Blackwell Technologies needs a director of specialized care services. The board just approved a new program for employees with family members requiring adaptive support. Permanent position, full benefits, and a budget to hire additional staff." Keisha's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. You didn't just help my grandfather communicate. You showed us that competence comes in many forms, and our job is to recognize and support it." Carson paused. "We need someone who understands that difference to run this program." Walter was already positioning objects, and Carson read his message aloud. "Smart hiring decision." 3 months later, the Blackwell Technologies Specialized Care Program was serving 43 employees with family members requiring adaptive support. Keisha had hired 6 additional caregivers, each trained in observation-based assessment and individualized communication strategies. The program's success rate, measured by family satisfaction and care recipient engagement, exceeded 90%. Walter remained at home, his daily routine now including 2 hours of remote consultation with company engineering teams. His grid-based communication system had been digitized into a tablet interface, allowing him to participate in video conferences and contribute to project reviews. The cost savings from his strategic insights had already exceeded his annual care expenses by a factor of 3. Carson learned to read his grandfather's communication as fluently as spoken conversation. Their relationship, strained by months of frustration and misunderstanding, had evolved into genuine partnership. Walter's wisdom tempered Carson's impatience. Carson's energy complemented Walter's experience. But perhaps more importantly, the program had changed how Blackwell Technologies thought about capability and worth. Employees no longer feared that family caregiving responsibilities would limit their career prospects. Parents of children with special needs, adult children caring for aging relatives, and spouses managing chronic conditions all found support and understanding rather than professional penalties. The ripple effects extended beyond the company. Other Atlanta businesses began implementing similar programs, recognizing that supporting employee caregiving responsibilities wasn't just ethically right, but economically smart. Talented people stayed instead of leaving for more accommodating employers. Productivity increased when workers weren't constantly stressed about family situations. Innovation flourished when diverse perspectives and problem-solving approaches were valued rather than ignored. Carson often reflected on how close he'd come to missing all of this. His grandfather's voice had never returned, but his wisdom spoke louder than ever. Keisha's refusal to accept conventional limitations had unlocked not just Walter's communication, but an entirely new understanding of human potential. The $50,000 bonus that had started it all seemed almost trivial now. Carson had offered money for a miracle. Instead, he'd received something far more valuable: the knowledge that miracles often look like careful attention, patient observation, and the willingness to believe that every person has something important to say. The question was never whether his grandfather could talk. The question was whether anyone was truly listening. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Sometimes the most important conversations happen without words at all. On a humid Thursday evening, 6 months later, Carson sat in his grandfather's study, reviewing quarterly reports, while Walter worked on a crossword puzzle at his usual table. The room felt comfortable now, lived in rather than clinical. The hospital bed had been replaced with a regular bedroom set. The grab bars remained, but no longer dominated the space. This was a home again, not a medical facility. Walter positioned 3 objects on his napkin, spelling out a question. Carson looked up from his laptop. "You're asking about the Morrison contract?" Walter nodded and continued positioning objects. Carson translated as he worked. "You think we should renegotiate the delivery timeline because their new procurement regulations will delay approval by 6 weeks anyway." Another nod. Walter had been monitoring industry news through his tablet interface, staying current on regulatory changes that could impact their projects. His insights had proven invaluable repeatedly, saving the company both time and money by anticipating obstacles that younger team members missed. Carson made a note to discuss the Morrison timeline with their project manager. "Thanks, Grandpa. I'll bring it up in tomorrow's staff meeting." Walter smiled and returned to his crossword, filling in answers with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Some things never changed, and Carson was grateful for that consistency. It anchored him in a world that had shifted dramatically over the past year. The doorbell rang, and Carson heard Keisha's voice greeting Maria, the housekeeper. Thursday evenings had become Keisha's time for program updates and family check-ins. As Director of Specialized Care Services, she now oversaw 68 families across the Atlanta metro area, but she still made time for personal visits with her original clients. "How's our favorite puzzle solver tonight?" she asked, entering the study with her ever-present notebook and a warm smile. Walter responded with a complex sequence of object positioning that made both Carson and Keisha laugh. Translated, it meant, "Still smarter than the board of directors." "I don't doubt it," Keisha replied, settling into her usual chair. "Speaking of smart decisions, Carson, I wanted to update you on the Richmond family. Remember Mrs. Richmond, the retired music teacher with early-stage Alzheimer's?" Carson nodded. The Richmond case had been challenging. Conventional memory care approaches weren't working, and the family was considering residential placement. "Her daughter called today," Keisha continued. "Mrs. Richmond is now teaching piano lessons again. 3 students, twice a week. Her long-term musical memory is completely intact, and playing familiar pieces helps organize her other cognitive functions." Walter positioned objects, and Carson read, "Music is mathematics made audible." "Exactly," Keisha said. "Mrs. Richmond's brain processes musical patterns differently than verbal or visual information. Once we identified that strength and built around it, everything else improved. Her sleep patterns, her appetite, her social engagement. These success stories had become routine, but they never stopped amazing Carson. The specialized care program had taught him that human capability was far more varied and resilient than medical textbooks suggested. Every person's brain found its own ways to adapt, to work around damage, to maintain function. The key was recognizing and supporting those individual strategies rather than forcing everyone into standard rehabilitation models. "How many families are we serving now?" Carson asked. 68 active cases, with 12 more starting next month, Keisha replied. "The waiting list is at 35. We're going to need to expand staff again." Carson pulled up the program budget on his laptop. The numbers were remarkable. The specialized care program's annual cost was $2.8 million, but employee retention savings alone exceeded $4.1 million. Adding in productivity, increases from reduced stress-related absences, and the strategic insights contributed by care recipients like Walter, the program generated a net positive return of almost $3 million annually. More importantly, it was changing lives. Families stayed together. Talented employees remained with the company. People who might otherwise be written off as declining or non-functional continued contributing their wisdom and experience to their communities. "Approve the expansion," Carson said, "and start planning for statewide rollout. We're getting calls from companies in Savannah, Augusta, and Columbus. Georgia needs this program." Walter positioned objects with obvious approval. The message read, "Good business is good ethics." The philosophy had become Blackwell Technologies' unofficial motto, printed on conference room walls and cited in shareholder reports. It reflected Walter's lifelong belief that profitable companies had obligations beyond profit, that sustainable success required investing in human potential rather than simply extracting value from human labor. As the evening wound down, Carson found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that desperate afternoon when he'd first offered $50,000 for a single word from his grandfather. He'd been thinking transactionally then, trying to solve a problem with money. But the real solution had required something much more valuable: patience, attention, and respect for different forms of intelligence. Walter had never spoken that single word Carson had originally wanted. But he'd said volumes about resilience, adaptation, and the persistence of human dignity in the face of physical limitation. He'd taught his grandson that leadership meant recognizing competence in unexpected forms and creating systems that allowed every person to contribute their unique strengths. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, and Walter automatically touched the face of his antique alarm clock. Some rituals endured, connecting past and present in ways that provided stability and meaning. Carson had learned to appreciate these consistencies rather than seeing them as symptoms of decline. "I should head home," Keisha said, gathering her materials. "Tomorrow's a busy day. We're interviewing candidates for the Augusta position, and I want to review their assessments tonight." "Drive carefully," Carson said. "And Keisha, thank you for everything." She smiled. "Thank you for being willing to learn a new language." After she left, Carson and Walter sat in comfortable silence for a while. The study felt peaceful in the evening light, filled with the quiet sounds of turning pages and clicking pen caps. 2 men, generations apart, each absorbed in his own work, but sharing the same space, the same purpose, the same commitment to building something meaningful. Walter positioned objects on his napkin, spelling out a longer message than usual. Carson read slowly, "Proud of the man you are becoming." The words carried weight that $50,000 never could. Carson looked at his grandfather, this brilliant engineer who had taught him that true communication required more than words, that real leadership meant listening for voices that spoke in different languages, that family meant adapting to each other's needs rather than demanding conformity to expectations. "I learned from the best, Grandpa," Carson replied. Walter smiled and returned to his crossword puzzle, filling in answers with steady, precise strokes. Outside, Atlanta's evening traffic hummed along Peachtree Street and Piedmont Road, 8 million people navigating their own challenges and changes. Some would find their voices in unexpected ways. Some would discover that limitation and possibility could coexist. Some would learn that the most important conversations happen when we're willing to listen in languages we don't yet understand. In the Blackwell study, an old clock ticked toward tomorrow, marking time in a house where time had learned to bend around human resilience, where silence had become eloquent, where a grandfather's puzzle had taught his grandson that the best solutions often come from the most unexpected places, and where a caregiver's refusal to accept conventional limitations had unlocked not just one person's voice, but an entire community's understanding of what human potential could look like when given the chance to flourish. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them. Sometimes the breakthrough we need is hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to see patterns instead of problems. The ripple effects of Walter's breakthrough extended far beyond the Blackwell mansion. Word spread through Atlanta's tight-knit business community about the 16-year-old CEO who had revolutionized corporate care policies after discovering his grandfather's hidden communication system. Within 6 months, 12 major employers had reached out to Keisha's department requesting consultation on their own employee support programs. The Georgia Chamber of Commerce invited Carson to speak at their annual healthcare symposium in Savannah. Standing before 300 business leaders in the historic convention center, he shared the stage with his grandfather for the first time since the stroke. Walter sat beside the podium with his tablet interface, ready to answer questions through their now seamless translation system. "When we started this journey," Carson told the assembled executives, "I thought I was solving a family problem. I didn't realize I was discovering a business opportunity." He gestured toward Walter. "My grandfather taught me that when we assume decline, we often create it. When we assume competence and look for new ways to recognize it, we usually find capabilities we never knew existed." The questions came rapidly. How much did the program cost? What was the return on investment? How did they measure success? Carson fielded the business inquiries while Walter tackled the technical ones, his tablet interface allowing him to display complex charts and data that he'd prepared beforehand. Dr. Amanda Foster, Chief Medical Officer at Emory Healthcare, raised her hand. "Mr. Blackwell, you mentioned that traditional rehabilitation failed with your grandfather. Can you elaborate on why standard approaches didn't work?" Walter's response filled his tablet screen. "Standard protocols assume standard brains. Stroke damage is individual. Recovery paths must be individual too. One size fits one." The room buzzed with murmured conversations. Dr. Foster leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that our rehabilitation programs are fundamentally flawed?" "Not flawed," Walter typed. "Incomplete. They work for some, need alternatives for others. Like having multiple tools in toolbox instead of just hammer." Carson watched his grandfather field questions with the same strategic thinking that had built Blackwell Technologies decades earlier. The stroke had taken Walter's voice, but left his intellect not just intact, but sharpened by challenge. He'd learned to express complex ideas with mathematical precision, choosing each word for maximum impact. After the presentation, they were approached by Maria Santos, superintendent of the DeKalb County School District. "Mr. Blackwell," she said to Carson, "we have students with communication differences who aren't succeeding with standard special education approaches. Would your program principles work in schools?" Walter was already typing before Carson could respond. "Children adapt faster than adults. More plastic brains could develop junior versions of system worth piloting." Carson found himself nodding. "We'd need to modify the approach for developmental differences, but the core principle remains the same. Look for competence in unexpected forms." Within 3 weeks, Keisha was consulting with DeKalb County's special education team. They identified 12 students who had been labeled as having severe communication disorders, but showed signs of systematic thinking in nonverbal areas. Using modified versions of Walter's grid-based approach, they began developing individualized communication strategies. The first breakthrough came with Marcus, an 8-year-old who had been mostly non-verbal since starting school. Traditional speech therapy had yielded minimal progress, and he was being considered for placement in a more restrictive educational setting. But Marcus showed exceptional spatial reasoning abilities, building complex structures with blocks and solving visual puzzles that challenged students twice his age. Keisha worked with his teacher to create a position-based communication system similar to Walter's, but adapted for a child's motor skills and attention span. Instead of placing objects on grids, Marcus used colored blocks on a felt board. Different positions represented different categories of communication: wants, feelings, ideas, questions. Within 2 weeks, Marcus was using his block system to participate in classroom discussions. He answered math problems by positioning blocks in sequences that represented numerical concepts. He shared stories by creating spatial narratives with his blocks, moving them through positions that his teacher learned to read like sentences. His mother, Sandra Williams, cried when she saw Marcus use his blocks to spell out, "I love you, Mom," during their first parent conference. "He's been trying to tell us things all along," she said. "We just didn't know how to listen." The success with Marcus opened doors to broader applications. Keisha began training teachers throughout the JUCA'S system, showing them how to identify students whose intelligence expressed itself through non-traditional channels. Visual learners who struggled with verbal instruction, kinesthetic thinkers who needed movement to process information, students with autism who had developed their own logical systems that didn't match neurotypical expectations. Carson found himself spending more time in schools than boardrooms, fascinated by how quickly children adapted to alternative communication methods. Their brains, more plastic than adult minds, seemed to embrace new languages with enthusiasm rather than resistance. "Kids don't have preconceptions about how communication should work," Keisha explained during one of their weekly program reviews. "Adults often resist new methods because they conflict with established patterns. Children just want to be understood." The program's success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Dr. James Patterson from the Centers for Disease Control called Carson directly, requesting a meeting to discuss the public health implications of their approach. He flew down from Atlanta's CDC headquarters to tour their facilities and observe their methods firsthand. "What you've developed here," Dr. Patterson told Carson as they sat in Walter's study, "has implications far beyond individual families or companies. We're seeing epidemic levels of social isolation among aging adults, partly because we assume communication decline means relationship decline." Walter typed on his tablet. "Loneliness kills faster than most diseases. Connection heals even when bodies don't." Dr. Patterson nodded vigorously. "Exactly. If we could scale your communication approaches, we might address not just individual quality of life, but community health outcomes." He paused, consulting his notes. "Would you consider a pilot partnership, CDC funding, for a multi-state demonstration project?" Carson looked at his grandfather, who was already typing. The message read, "Big opportunity, big responsibility, worth doing if done right." The CDC partnership launched 6 months later with pilot sites in Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. Each location adapted the core Blackwell principles to their specific demographics and resources. Rural communities developed simplified versions suitable for lower literacy populations. Urban areas created technology-enhanced systems for families comfortable with digital interfaces. Retirement communities integrated the approaches into existing social programming. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Pilot participants showed measurable improvements in social engagement, cognitive stimulation, and emotional well-being. Family caregiver stress decreased significantly when they learned to recognize and support alternative communication methods. Healthcare costs dropped as participants remained in community settings longer and required fewer crisis interventions. But perhaps most importantly, the program began changing cultural attitudes about aging and disability. Communities that participated in the pilots reported increased respect for older adults and people with communication differences. When local leaders saw Walter addressing city council meetings through his tablet interface, offering insights on municipal technology initiatives, it shifted perceptions about who could contribute meaningfully to civic life. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution featured Walter on their front page, photographing him at his communication station in the Blackwell Technologies conference room. The headline read, "Silent Voice Speaks Volumes. Stroke Survivor Leads Corporate Innovation Through Alternative Communication." The article sparked national interest. Carson found himself fielding calls from companies across the country wanting to implement similar programs. Universities requested research partnerships. Healthcare systems inquired about training their rehabilitation teams in alternative communication assessment. CNN's Anderson Cooper scheduled an interview, traveling to Atlanta to meet Walter and Carson at the Buckhead Mansion. Cooper, known for his thoughtful approach to complex stories, spent hours learning Walter's communication system before the cameras rolled. "Mr. Blackwell," Cooper said during the live broadcast, "you've essentially created a new language. What would you want people to understand about communication differences?" Walter's response, displayed on screen as Carson translated, was characteristically precise. Different doesn't mean deficit. Complex doesn't mean impossible. Silent doesn't mean empty. Listen for intelligence in unexpected forms. Cooper turned to Carson. "As a young CEO, what has this experience taught you about leadership?" "That the best leaders don't just communicate their own vision," Carson replied. "They create systems that allow other people's wisdom to be heard and valued. My grandfather taught me that there's a difference between being in charge and being in service." The interview generated thousands of comments and shares, many from families dealing with similar communication challenges. People shared stories of relatives who had been written off as declining but showed signs of preserved intelligence. Healthcare workers described patients they suspected were more aware than standard assessments indicated. Keisha's phone rang constantly with requests for consultation. She hired additional staff and began developing training programs for healthcare professionals, educators, and family caregivers. The Blackwell approach was becoming a movement, spreading through networks of people who had experienced the frustration of trying to communicate through broken systems. One call particularly moved her. Margaret Chen, calling from San Francisco, described her husband's experience after a severe brain injury. "The doctors say he has significant cognitive impairment," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes I catch him organizing things in patterns, like he's trying to tell me something. Could your system work for traumatic brain injury?" Keisha scheduled a video consultation, walking Margaret through basic assessment techniques. Within days, Margaret discovered that her husband had developed his own method of expressing needs and preferences through object arrangement. He couldn't speak, and his motor skills were limited, but his mind remained active and engaged. "I thought I was losing him," Margaret said during their follow-up call. "Now I realize he was trying not to lose me." These individual breakthroughs accumulated into systemic change. Medical schools began incorporating alternative communication assessment into their curricula. Occupational therapy programs added courses on non-traditional expression methods. Speech pathology departments expanded beyond verbal rehabilitation to include alternative and augmentative communication systems. The professional resistance that Keisha had expected never fully materialized. Most healthcare providers, she discovered, were frustrated by the limitations of standard approaches and eager for tools that actually helped their patients. The Blackwell method gave them permission to think creatively and individually about each person's communication needs. Dr. Sarah Kim, Chief of Rehabilitation Medicine at Atlanta's Shepherd Center, became one of the program's strongest advocates. What Walter Blackwell demonstrated, she told a conference of neurologists, is that recovery doesn't always look like returning to previous function. Sometimes it looks like discovering new capabilities that were always there, but needed different expression methods. The medical community's acceptance legitimized the approach for families who had been hesitant to try non-traditional methods. Insurance companies began covering alternative communication assessments. Medicare expanded coverage for individualized communication devices and training. Carson watched these changes with amazement and growing responsibility. What had started as a desperate attempt to help his grandfather had evolved into a national conversation about human potential and communication equity. He was 19 now, still young, but carrying the weight of leadership in ways he hadn't anticipated at 16. Walter, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in rehabilitation circles. He appeared at medical conferences via video link, answering questions about his communication system development and offering insights on patient-centered care approaches. His engineering background gave him credibility with medical professionals who might have dismissed alternative approaches from less technically trained advocates. During one particularly memorable presentation to the American Stroke Association, Walter addressed the question of whether his system could work for patients with different types of communication impairments. His response, displayed on screen, was comprehensive. System adapts to user, not reverse. Grid method works for motor limitations. Color coding works for visual learners. Sequential patterns work for memory challenges. Principle remains same. Find person's strength, build communication bridge from there. The questions continued for over an hour, with Walter demonstrating his system's flexibility by adapting his responses to match different communication challenges. He showed how the grid could be modified for patients with limited mobility, how colors and shapes could substitute for spatial positioning, how familiar objects could replace abstract symbols for people with memory impairments. Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the association's president, concluded the session with obvious admiration. Mr. Blackwell, you've essentially created a universal design approach to communication. Your system doesn't just work despite your limitations. It works because you designed around your strengths. Exactly, Walter typed. Disability is mismatch between person and environment. Change environment to match person instead of forcing person to match environment. The philosophy resonated far beyond medical circles. Educators began applying similar principles in classrooms. Employers reconsidered their approaches to workplace accommodation. Architects incorporated communication accessibility into building design. The ripple effects continued expanding, touching systems and institutions that had never considered their communication assumptions. Back in Atlanta, the Blackwell Mansion had become an informal pilgrimage site for families seeking hope and practical solutions. Carson and Walter welcomed visitors regularly, sharing their story and demonstrating their communication methods. The study, where Walter's breakthrough had occurred now, served as a training center, with families traveling from across the country to learn alternative communication approaches. One humid Saturday afternoon, the Williamson family from Birmingham arrived for a consultation. Their 18-year-old son, David, had been in a coma for 6 weeks after a motorcycle accident. He had recently awakened but remained largely non-verbal, showing responses that doctors couldn't clearly interpret. Walter worked with David directly, using simple versions of his positioning system to assess cognitive function. Within an hour, it became clear that David's awareness was much higher than his medical team had recognized. He could follow complex instructions, solve spatial problems, and express preferences through object manipulation. "He's in there," Walter typed for the family. "Brain is reorganizing around damage, needs time and different pathways. Don't give up." David's mother, Patricia Williamson, wept with relief. "The doctors said we should prepare for limited recovery, but I knew he was trying to communicate something." Keisha worked with the family to develop a modified communication system suitable for David's current abilities and likely recovery trajectory. They started with simple yes-no positioning, gradually building toward more complex expression methods as David's motor skills improved. 3 months later, David was using a tablet-based version of Walter's system to participate in his high school graduation ceremony. He couldn't deliver a traditional speech, but his tablet displayed a message that brought the entire auditorium to their feet. "Thank you for not giving up on me. This is not the end of my story. This is chapter 2. Stories like David's reinforced Carson's conviction that their work was just beginning. Each breakthrough revealed new possibilities, new applications, new populations who might benefit from alternative communication approaches. The program that had started with one desperate teenager and his silent grandfather was becoming a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability and worth. As Carson prepared for his 20th birthday, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that first desperate offer of $50,000. He was no longer just trying to solve a family problem. He was part of a broader effort to expand society's understanding of intelligence, communication, and human potential. Walter, now 79, remained the philosophical center of their growing movement. His daily communication with engineering teams had evolved into informal mentorship for young employees facing their own family caregiving challenges. His insights on adaptive system design influenced everything from user interface development to corporate policy formation. But perhaps most importantly, Walter had become living proof that limitation could coexist with contribution, that silence could be eloquent, that different forms of intelligence deserved recognition and respect. His grid-based communication system had saved more than his own voice. It had amplified voices across the country that might otherwise have been lost to assumptions about decline and defeat. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued marking time in a house where time had learned to accommodate human resilience rather than rushing past it. Where patience had proven more valuable than speed, where listening had mattered more than speaking, where one family's refusal to accept conventional limitations had opened new possibilities for thousands of others. In the end, Carson never did get that single word he had originally wanted from his grandfather. Instead, he got something infinitely more valuable, a new language for understanding human worth, a system for recognizing intelligence in unexpected forms, and a demonstration that the most important conversations often happen when we're willing to learn entirely new ways of listening. If you want more true, human stories like this, hit subscribe and stay with us. Sometimes the most powerful voices speak in languages we haven't learned yet.